The concept of free-to-play is kind of a newcomer in the game industry. It used to be that you see a game, say, hey, that looks cool, and then you go and buy that game. The end, just a very straightforward process for both the game maker and the player. But free-to-play is different. When I first heard of free-to-play back in the day, I had a very hard time wrapping my head around that idea. It's extremely complicated compared to the traditional pay-to-play model. I'll try to explain to you now about this subject. But first, a small disclaimer. So this video is going to be a very basic and dumbed down overview into the matter. Secondly, monetization is a rapidly evolving field of work. So I encourage you to always look at the newest game releases and trends to get the best idea of how companies are turning free-to-play into a profit. But with that said, let's get into it. Fight! If we want to really boil it down, there are two ways in which a free-to-play game can make money to its developer. Advertisements, and number two is in-game purchases, also known as microtransactions. We'll look at advertisements first. The idea with game developers using ads to make money from their free-to-play game is rather simple. Basically, all they have to do is create moments and spaces inside the game where an ad can be shown to the player. And then the developer rents out, so to speak, those spaces to advertisers. It's the same as with billboards, newspapers, TV channels, and so on. If you own a platform in which ads can be shown, then companies will want to pay you to have their ad on it. Except in a mobile game context, the difference is that between the platform provider, meaning the game developer, and the advertiser, meaning the company who wants their ads displayed, there usually exists also a third-party service such as Google AdMob. They function as an agent and a middleman of sorts. You can imagine the difference in amount of work between this and a traditional way of advertising. Whereas a newspaper editor needs to be in touch individually with every single company that wants their ads on the page and going over all the specifics one by one with them. In contrast, a game developer can acquire an unlimited amount of advertisers basically instantly. Like you just fill a form and you're done. Ads are great because they allow the game developer to create revenue and stay in business, even though the players or customers of the game are actually spending nothing at all. It's a win-win for all involved, and to the player it can feel like a fair deal, or even quite a steal. The problem with ads is that even if the deal is fair, no player actually enjoys watching ads, rather they just endure them. Also, the amount of money that the developer gets from one ad being displayed one time is absolutely insignificant, so hundreds of thousands or even millions of ad views are needed before they start to accumulate into anything meaningful. You want to show as many ads as possible during your gameplay to rake in the profits, but if you show too many, you'll end up just frustrating the players and losing their interest. Now let's look at some of the types of ads that exist in games. I would categorize them into four groups. Number one is the banner ad. This is a small graphic at the edge of the screen during gameplay. This is probably the biggest offender in terms of annoyance. They're distracting to the player, they ruin the aesthetic of the game, and also cause accidental misclicks sometimes if they're poorly placed. Number two is the Interstitial Ad. This is a full screen graphic or a video that is shown during a break, basically just like commercial breaks on TV. It's usually easy to find a suitable moment in a game to display interstitial ads, such as between stages. This is simply due to how most games are structured into moments of action and moments of downtime. Number three is the Incentivized Ad. So the player is offered a deal. Volunteer to watch a full screen video ad and you'll receive a valuable in-game reward. Whereas interstitial ads can be skipped, incentivized ads usually run for 30 seconds. Number 4, the in-game ad. This means placing ads inside the game world. For example, driving past a roadside billboard in a racing game. This can also take the form of what's known as product placement. By the way, this kind of subliminal marketing has been made illegal in some countries, so there is possibly some moral ambiguity about this. These types of in-game ads are pretty unusual and are typically only attempted by bigger studios and publishers. As for strategies on how to use ads, I'd say if you just use common sense and your own experience as a player and a user, then it should be pretty easy to weed out the problematic ad usage. Alright, and next we will look at the in-app purchases. So, the base game is free for anyone to play, that's the idea of free to play, but the developers can lock certain optional content or features behind a paywall. So while playing the game, the player can still choose to spend a little bit of money to get something extra in the game. The idea is that even though the vast majority of players will probably never ever spend a single dime on the game, there are enough players in the world who will want to pay for the optional content, and thanks to them the game can create a revenue. Even if we're only talking about like 1 in 100 players. So, what can be put behind a paywall in a free-to-play game? One is cosmetics, meaning the player is able to visually personalize the game by acquiring things like costumes for their character. The great thing about cosmetic items for the developer's point of view is that they're usually pretty low effort to make. Assuming that the game is programmed in a flexible way and technically allows the swapping of graphics on the fly. Then there's also cosmetic seasonal content like summer costumes, Halloween costumes, Christmas costumes, and so on. The downside of cosmetics is that they don't fit every game genre and really only make sense in a multiplayer environment. There's not a lot of motivation for players to decorate their characters if the only person who's ever gonna see them is themselves. Then there is pay to win, and with this one the name says it all really. So in contrast to cosmetics, the point here is to let the player change the rules of the game, so buying things like permanent upgrades and temporary boosters that make the player stronger and the game easier. Conversely to cosmetics, pay to win only really makes sense in a versus CPU game, meaning usually offline single player games. Obviously, if the game allows pay to win to exist in a competitive multiplayer environment, then the player who just spends the most amount of money on the game has the biggest advantage. So now what you have is a game that feels unfair, and this in turn eats away at the size of the player base. Some games put progressing in a game behind a paywall too, like maybe after beating a certain amount of stages or just spending a certain amount of hours in the game. And to keep playing past this point, the player can either take a time out and wait for a while, or pay a little bit and skip the whole waiting period. It's basically holding the fun hostage until you pay the ransom. So next, let's look at in-game currency. Very often when a game offers optional in-game purchases, the player does not buy them directly with real-world money, meaning dollars or euros or whatever. Instead, these purchases are made using a virtual currency that exists only inside the game. Usually it's called something fancy like emeralds, silver coins. How this works is the player can exchange real-world money for fake money, and then use the fake money to buy whatever optional in-game content they want. This seems kind of like an unnecessary step, right? Like, why make the player jump through this hoop at all? Well, there are some very good reasons for this, like not having to charge the player's credit card every single time that the purchase is made. In-game currency can also be acquired by simply playing the game. It's like a salary that the player earns. So now the player is not just killing time by playing the game, but they're actually creating a value. If you play some popular free-to-play mobile games, you'll notice that the player is rewarded for almost everything they do inside the game. All in all, this system is all about increasing playtime. The longer someone plays, the more ads can be shown to them, and thus more revenue is created. And the developer is able to pump up what is known as player retention. This is a metric that shows what percentage of players keep coming back to the game after 1 day, or 7 days, or even 30 days, and so on. Next, a few honorable mentions. There's a few things that I couldn't categorize or fit into any of the previous segments, but I think they're still worth mentioning on the topic of free-to-play monetization. Disabling ads. If the game has ads, then almost without exception there should be a way to disable the ads for a fee. It's just one of those things that if it's not there, a lot of people will be upset. Special offer. During some interstitial moment in a game, the player is not shown an ad from Google AdMob this time, but from the game itself. And the ad is about a content package. And all of this is available for one discounted price, less than what it would cost to buy all of them separately. The special offer will also be timed, so it will include the fear of missing out. Games as a service. A season pass is a one-time purchase that gives the player access to all the upcoming content for X amount of time, usually it's a year. Then there's also the monthly subscription model, which is basically the same thing but a shorter payment interval. Naturally, these models are only viable if the developer plans to constantly update their game by adding more and more extra content. The infamous loot box is a mechanism that's received its fair share of criticism over the years, mostly because it's been interpreted as promoting gambling. The idea is that optional content, most often cosmetic items, are offered to the player inside the game, but instead of directly purchasing the content that they want, the player instead purchases a chance to win the item that they're looking for. The most desirable items are the rarest, of course, to appear from these boxes. So to get them, the player might have to open tens or maybe even hundreds of boxes. If there's anything positive about loot boxes, I'd say they increased the excitement. Other than that, they've been largely condemned as immoral, and the practice has even been made illegal in some countries. You might be thinking, alright, all these monetization methods and strategies exist, but which one is right for my game? Free-to-play is a challenging endeavor, so you can't leave any stone unturned as a developer. As long as you can find the time and the energy to implement these mechanisms, there's really no reason not to, since every little bit helps. And finally, before we wrap this video up, I just want to reiterate that this is still an evolving industry. And in fact, more than the next big game idea or IP, game companies and publishers are looking for the next big monetization idea. If you can come up with a new, interesting, fun and effective way to translate free-to-play into revenue, then the sky is the limit.